Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry. My question for the night is, why do we not let students fail? And you might be thinking this is about failing a grade, but more so this is about the concept of getting students to understand that failure is not as bad as they think it is, and that failure is a necessary part of learning, and it's such an important task when teaching students how to develop sense of grit and perseverance and hard work. So we're going to talk about these strategies that you can use in your classroom to help your students to fail more often and be comfortable with that failure so that they can persevere through challenges, work hard to accomplish their goals, and demonstrate a level of grit. So thank you again for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a 4-5 split grade teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I come to you every single week with a new episode of this series to talk about all things using inquiry-based teaching, as well as other teaching practices in your classroom. And it is my hope that through these videos, I can help you to see that inquiry-based learning can be engaging and fun and easy for both you and your students. So thank you again, and I can't wait to talk about this. This is part 2 of my 4-part series on goal setting, and specifically I wanted to talk about the concept of failure. I think failure is such a scary word for most of our students because they are afraid to fail. They see failure as meaning they're going to get in huge trouble, or they see failure as the thing to avoid the most. Often it might even be something that's threatened against them. You don't want to fail. You don't want to be a failure. However, this sets our students up for less than success because failure and failing is part of the learning journey. The first time you do something, you're never going to do it perfectly. In fact, the first time you try something, you're probably going to fail. So getting our students to realize that through skills such as perseverance, grit, and hard work, they can turn those failures into successes. And teaching our students how to fail is less about teaching them to do poorly, but more about teaching them that failure is expected and how to dig themselves back out and recover from that failure is the most important goal. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do. The first thing I really like to do is to show students diagnostic assessments. This gives me a baseline at the beginning of a learning unit as to what students know already. It tells me where they need to go, and it tells me what they already do know. It sets them up to understand what's coming and what it is that they're expected to be able to achieve by the end. Now, often questions on a diagnostic assessment reflect the learning that's expected at the end of that learning unit, learning that has not been taught yet, or reviewing concepts that might not be exactly the most familiar to them. Using diagnostic assessments will help you to pinpoint the skills that those students need to focus on and learn the most. Now, when students are participating in diagnostic assessments, there is a tremendous amount of failure that's a part of that because they simply have to say, I don't know because I've not been taught this yet. Getting them to understand that this is part of the learning process, that we can't know where we need to go if we don't know where we are. So therefore, you need to give it a try. You need to take the risk, and you need to be willing to fail on all of this because it will help us in the long run to figure out where we need to go and how we're going to get there. Often when I start a new unit in math, I will give students a diagnostic assessment. And this time period is full of some frustration and anxiety and overwhelm. And this is normal. And I need to normalize these feelings as not feelings that are going to persist and last forever, but they are initial feelings that resemble the reason our brain is stretching and growing and learning. So we'll talk about that. What are you feeling right now? What does this mean? And we've gone through these conversations. So the very first time I give a diagnostic assessment, I will go through that narrative of, this is what learning feels like. It's like a fight or flight response. And encounter something difficult and you want to flee and stop and shut down and turn it off and not even try, because your fear of failing or doing poorly is stopping you from taking the risk to actually challenge yourself and get through this task. Now, by the end of that first learning unit where we did the diagnostic, I will spend a lot of time during that unit reflecting on, do you remember 2 days ago when we were doing the diagnostic and you completed question 1 and you were feeling very stressed and overwhelmed? 2 days later, after we've learned something that was represented on the diagnostic, I will ask my students to reflect, how are you feeling now about it? And getting them to understand that they have worked themselves out of those feelings of stress and fear and overwhelm. And this is not about, we need to teach them what failure feels like so that they know how to recognize it, and then they have the experience to get themselves out of that sense of failure and that fear so that they can persevere through it instead of shutting down in flight. So if you think about failure in terms of like tying your shoes for the very first time. The first time you tried to tie your shoes, you were probably not so great at it. I know trying to teach my kids how to tie their shoes, this is a task where we try it, they show some interest, we try it, they try it a little bit, they don't get it the first time. It might take 100 attempts at trying to tie their shoes. Eventually, they are very physically capable of being able to tie their shoes, but there are going to be a lot of opportunities for them to not be so good at it and for it to fail before they actually succeed. So we want to help them to use these diagnostic assessments to paint the picture that things can be hard, but we can overcome them, and really reflecting on that piece as look at what you did then and look at how far you've come. Now with that, so you start with the diagnostic assessment. The other piece is really looking at self-reflection check-ins and using this frequently. So after you have covered what the learning goal is, what the success criteria is, you've taught a couple of lessons, it's really important to check in with students to talk about how it is they're feeling. Do they get the concept? Do they not get the concept? Are they struggling? How are they feeling about this thing that you just taught them or the thing that they just learned? So in my classroom, we have a modified stoplight, is what I like to call it. And it is a chart paper that has 4 colored circles on it. The very first circle is green and it says, I understand all of it. I could teach others about this. I am very confident about my understanding. And then this next circle is yellow, and this is 3. So I have a 3 inside the yellow circle. It says, I get it most of the time. I understand most of it, and I can do most of it on my own. So I might need help a little bit. I might not fully understand everything, but I think I'm doing okay. The third circle down is orange and has a number 2 in it, and it says, I am confused. And I sort of get some of it and I sort of don't get some of it. And I need a little help. Now, clearly these are put in student-friendly language because it's them that is using this all of the time to be able to self-reflect. And finally, the 4th circle down is red and has a number 1 inside of it. And it says, I am struggling, I don't get any of it, and I need a lot of help. So once you have this goal setting established, getting students to reflect on how they're doing is an imperative tool to get them to understand where they currently are now and what their next step is going to be. It also will prompt them to understand, can I move ahead or do I need to ask for extra help? They need to take charge of their own learning. What I want to avoid is passive participants in my classroom where they're simply waiting for learning to happen to them instead of them taking the control of their own learning. I really, really want my students to take control, to understand where they are, and that if they are the ones that are deciding that they would like help, then they take an active role to find the help that they want. They can ask for extra help. They can decide to do a few more practice questions. They can work at home with their parents on different activities that will help to practice that concept. They can redo questions that we've done before, really getting them to push themselves to become active participants where they are in control of their own success and they have the autonomy of choice to decide whether or not they are or are not going to be successful. And that means too that their successes as well as their failures are very much the responsibility of them. I am here providing a lot of support for my students, but I am not ultimately the one that gets to decide how successful they are going to be, because they play an integral role in determining their own success through their hard work and their perseverance. Now that leads to the next strategy, which is goal setting. Now, because students are self-reflecting and they're identifying that there might be an area of need or there may be a gap that they're experiencing where they're not sure what it is that they need to do next. Maybe they've identified that they're not strong in a certain area. Once they understand where it is that they're falling apart, the next step is to teach them to get out of that feeling, that failure is a part of this journey and that we can experience failure, but then what are we going to do next? What's that next step? So goal setting here is an integral part of this process. When students experience negative failures, they need to then create goals that will help them move forward to get over those tripping hazards that perhaps made them fail in the first place or made them not as successful as they could be. So I like to talk very specifically with my students about goals. Now, because I'm talking about 9 and 10-year-olds, goals sometimes they seem very broad. I want their goals to be very narrow and very specific, such as I will put capital letters at the first word of every sentence. That could be a very specific goal for a student that is struggling with putting capital letters at the beginning of their sentence. But I also want them not to have to pull these goals out of thin air. So I will come up with categories of goals, such as for writing. So in writing, I have broken down the variety of learning needs that I find as students in grade 5 and grade 4 have as writers, and I've broken them up into 4 categories. And then I have these categories and I have goals that fall under these categories as well. So my goals will come up with brainstorming, and they will have to do with style and form, as well as looking at the different skills that they might need. And I have about 4 or 5 goals under each one of these categories that will allow students to be more successful with these goals. So in this goal board, I have the 4 different categories. The first one for writing is spark an idea. And this surrounds goals that would be related to brainstorming and idea generation. And then for the second type of goal for writing, I would have time to write. Now this is more focused on the drafting process, where students would have to talk about research notes and plot structure, using research sources, text features, following a planner when they're writing. It's a lot about drafting and some organizational skills in that set of goals. So if that is an area that students are struggling with, and they will typically choose a goal from that category. Third category along is author style and skill, and this is where we're talking a lot about appropriate vocabulary, details and descriptions, sentence variety, and voice. And finally, this is the revising and editing category of goals, where we're talking about mechanics, spelling and grammar, looking at punctuation, capital letters, and using the editing and revising strategies that we discuss in class. So depending on where the student is will determine which goal they select. Now they're not restricted specifically to these goals and these wordings, but it definitely does give students a guideline as to what it is that they are working on. Now, the next phase that students will work on in their goals is moving forward to looking at celebrating failure. So that kind of from goal setting, then we go into celebrating failure. Now, this does not mean that we are celebrating the failure as it's happening. Oh, look, and pointing out, oh, look, there's Johnny and he's just sucking today. That's not what we're talking about. Now, I recently heard an analogy to this where we talked about looking at open wounds or scars. And I really thought that this was a great analogy to talk about celebrating failures. An open wound, so if you fall down on your bike and you scrape your knee, as many kids might do, it's an open wound. It's gross. It might be oozing. You need immediate help right in there in that moment. It's kind of gross. It's mucky. It's not really something we want to be celebrating. However, over time, as the hurt goes away, the crying stops, the bleeding subsides, and your body begins to heal, a scar will be developed. We can celebrate failures by not focusing on the failures as they're happening in terms of when it's like a wound and on a scraped knee and it's gross and dirty and messy. That might not be what we're celebrating, because that's going to be too raw and too sensitive to be pointing out and probably not the most appropriate. However, focusing on your scars and talking about a time when you did fail and how you got out of it, focusing on the process of overcoming failure is really where we're celebrating. Celebrating a student who handed you in a copy of their first draft of writing and it wasn't great, and focusing on what they've done and moved it forward. So they've got a great draft of writing now, but not focusing on the fact that they've got a great draft of writing now, but focusing on the journey that got them there, where they messed up and how they got there. This is one of my favorite things to do when I've got a split grade, because a lot of my students from grade 4 will also be my students for grade 5. This is a great opportunity to use their own scars as writers to be talking about the progress that they made. There is such a tremendous amount of progress that happens in their writing skills from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Students will often comment at the end of the year on their reflections when they're looking at their pieces of writing to prove that they have grown as a writer to me. They will comment about how horrible their first draft of writing was and how much they have learned and how much their writing has improved. This is a great opportunity the following year to talk about those scars. The scars of the fact that the first time you try something, it's not probably going to be great, but how you got so much better. People can latch on to that. Students can latch on to those examples, that they understand that there's a way out. There's a light at the end of their failure tunnel, and with hard work and the perseverance to get there, they themselves can also walk out of that feeling of failure and feeling like they're not able to do anything. Especially this is true when they are capable, celebrating the failure, and they're capable of getting themselves out. We don't want to set our students up for a failure in which they cannot overcome. We're really looking at those small failures where things are hard, but something that they can learn and overcome. The next phase here is looking at feedback and assessment. We can't simply just rely on student self-assessment to be the only indicator of how much they are succeeding. One of the ways that we can also help them to understand that maybe they weren't so great at the beginning and now they are is through feedback and assessment. Having those conversations with students where we are telling them what it is that they need to be doing. We are talking with them about how they are going to overcome these obstacles that are in the road, what their next step is, where they are in terms of their grade or their assessment. Giving them feedback and assessment is a really key tool for that. Now, one of the ways that I like to do this is through constant conferences with my students. I will have a schedule up on my board that labels which students I'm conferencing for language, or through guided instruction through math, who I am meeting with groups. And these groups are constantly flexible and always changing as to who's meeting with me when. Keep those students on their toes so they're not really sure of the categories as to why I'm picking different students to come to see me or not. But I also want to give students an opportunity to set the stage for those conversations and those conferences with me. So I will give them an opportunity to fill out initial information in a feedback form so that it solicits, it tells me that they're ready for my feedback and formalizes these conversations so that they know that that conversation we're having is an important one. Now, I do have some warnings and be careful ideas here, is because failure is an essential part of learning, but we do have to be aware that we don't want to set our students up for the type of failure in which they cannot overcome. The failure that we're talking about tonight are the very small obstacles that might be in their road from where they are now to where we know that they can achieve. So we do want to make sure that the failures that our students are experiencing are overcomable. So we want to make sure that we are not setting them up for situations in which they are not going to be successful. We want to be very careful with students with learning disabilities that the tasks that we're asking them, they are capable of moving themselves out of, that we are aware of their learning profiles so that we know where to challenge them and where not to challenge them. Students with learning disabilities are still capable of experiencing failure. In fact, it might be something that they have been familiar with. It's teaching them to work through it and work around it so that they can compensate for some of those issues that they might have that are impacting their learning disability, and teaching them kind of the workaround to get past that. Teaching students to fail is an integral part of our job because learning means failure. Learning means that you are going to fail. When you get on that bike, you are not simply going to be able to ride it the first time. You are not going to be able to tie your shoes the first time. Failure really comes down to failure is success in progress. So it means that it's how you get to success. You need to expect failure along the way. And this is an important conversation for us to have with our students, because the world that they are living in will require them to problem solve. It will require them to take control of their own environment and to figure out that there's going to be upsets in their life that they need to be able to overcome. 9 and 10 and 11 years old is a great time to learn how to fail in a safe and supportive environment where they can learn how to overcome failure, and it is much easier for them to learn this lesson now at this age than it is when they're in high school, when they're in university, or when they are in their adulthood, where failure often has catastrophic consequences, or consequences that are much more serious than simply them getting a C or a D on a piece of writing in the beginning of grade 5. So thank you so much for joining me, and we will be continuing our goal setting series next Monday night at 9 p.m. If you would like more information about this series or sign up for notifications, you can go and find that at www.madlylearning.com. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.